Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we have a fun topic, or at least I think so. We're gonna talk about the orchids which are just easygoing, they're vigorous, they don't give us any headaches, versus the ones that I call finicky. You might have heard me a lot of times saying this one is finicky, but this one, she never gave me headaches, it just grew. Well, what do I actually mean when I say this? How do finicky orchids actually act? Well, that's what we're gonna find out today, and if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more videos from me on a daily basis, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and even if YouTube will not show you that I posted anything new, check back soon because I do post pretty much every day. So first of all, for me, finicky orchids are the ones that simply don't want to grow. They just don't want to create roots, don't want to grow leaves. I'm not referring here to blooming or anything, that's a whole different story. And when I say that an orchid is a little bit more difficult, I pretty much never mean it doesn't want to bloom. For me, vegetative growth is actually more important than blooming, because flowering is only possible if an orchid grows strongly from the point of view of leaves and roots. If an orchid produces its core structures, such as the pseudobulbs, leaves and roots, then flowering is pretty much a piece of cake. Well, for the vast majority of cases. So if orchids have problems developing roots and leaves, well, that's when we can talk about finicky orchids. Now, the reason for them being so fussy can vary actually. So let's take them in no particular order. The first reason why an orchid might not develop how you expect it to develop is because you simply do not have the appropriate environment for it. Now, in cultivation, it is pretty easy for us to provide the basic requests that orchid have. If we're dealing with an orchid which prefers more moisture, we can opt for a more water-retentive medium or simply water it more often. If an orchid prefers more light, we can place it closer to the window or move it to a southern window. If an orchid wants more fertilizer, we can provide more fertilizer. If an orchid wants lower temperatures, we can... What can we do about that? Out of all the things orchids need, temperature is, in my opinion, the hardest one to play around with, particularly for home growers. Of course, if you have a greenhouse and you can actually control all the elements in the environment inside, it might be a piece of cake. But for the home grower trying to grow a pretty cool growing orchid, it might prove to be quite the hassle. Regarding temperature, orchids are split into three main categories: the cool growers, the intermediate growers, and the warm growers. In a normal or typical home environment, we do great with intermediate and warm growers. Phalaenopsis, Cattleyas, Dendrobiums, Oncidiums, Vanda orchids, and all sorts of other beautiful orchids, they all can do very great in a home environment from the point of view of temperature. But then here comes the Masdevallias. Those orchids are more of a cool to intermediate growers. Many of them are actually pretty cool growers. So unless you have a dedicated room in your house where you can keep the temperature at 10 degrees Celsius, you might struggle a bit with the cool growers. Masdevallias, Draculas, some Dendrobiums, and other cool growers can struggle a little bit in normal or typical home conditions. If we feel comfortable in the house, they will not. As a result, the orchids will not perform well. Leaves might yellow and fall, new leaves will not be produced, new roots might not appear at all as well. Not to mention flowering, that's always the last thing that I consider. In cultivation, these types of orchids are usually grown in a dedicated setup with a cooling system, a misting system, pretty much whatever we can do to imitate the cloud forest environment that these orchids really actually love. For this reason, I do consider these orchids finicky simply because I, just like most of you guys, cannot really offer those really nice cool temperatures. I don't even live in a cool country. I'm in a subtropical climate. That doesn't really help me. So I personally do struggle with these orchids. There are only a few exceptions that I'm trying to grow. This is one of them, and as you can see, it's just not very successful. But for me, this is a very finicky orchid which can lose all of her leaves in an instant if it gets a little bit too warm for her liking, and she's always pretty much at risk of completely dying off, simply due to the environment. And this is my finicky Masdevallia. Relative humidity is again an environmental factor that we can control. It's easier to control than temperature. If we purchase an ultrasonic humidifier, pretty much our problems are over. The problem is when we have big collections. But that's for a different story. In any case, with humidity, we can actually play around a little bit. But just so you know, there are indeed orchids out there which really cannot stand dry air all that much. Nelly-Eilers and Miltoniopsis are some of them. Not only they prefer intermediate temperatures, but they do like their humidity. Again, it doesn't mean they cannot tolerate drought or very dry air for short periods of time, but overall they will perform so much better in a humid environment with a lot of water at their disposal, but ventilation as well, with lower temperatures rather than high temperature, and as a side note, not with direct sunshine either. So these orchids, as you can see, I do have a few of them, but I cannot say I'm very successful. I have a few tricks up my sleeve. I'm currently trying to grow them in sphagnum moss and a clay pot, which through evaporative cooling stays a little cooler. I have an ultrasonic humidifier, but overall I cannot guarantee they will do great. As I was saying, I'm in a subtropical climate. So for me, these orchids are indeed finicky. But for somebody who has a more temperate climate, they might actually be a breeze. So there is actually a degree of personal reasons when it comes to this. So as you can see, environment can play a major role, and many of my finicky orchids are actually finicky because of the environment. It's a big and bushy subject, but let's move on to another reason why orchids might be finicky, and this is genetic predisposition to being finicky. If an orchid cannot adapt pretty fast to its environment, then it will have problems in creating a root system, growing vigorous growth to sustain herself, and so on. In cultivation, there are instances when we do move around orchids, we transport them from the nursery to the store to our growing spaces. There is a lot of stress. After all of that stress, if an orchid does not have enough vigor, then it will pose problems. It will grow very slow, it will not produce a root system, and so on. Now that's a finicky orchid, but the reason isn't environment. So you can have one of those orchids, which is a worm grower, let's say Cattleya. She does not need high humidity, she does not need low temperatures, and still she refuses to grow. Well, sometimes it might just be genetics. And not only hybrids can experience this, some species as well, because yet again in cultivation, we still propagated it. And through propagation, again, we can lose some of the traits. Depends on the method, and here we are. Some of them are just more vigorous than others. A third possibility why an orchid can be very finicky right now is because of a bad history. There are cases in which very vigorous orchid have been just so mistreated for so long that their energy resources are very low. Frequent repottings, cutting of roots, cutting of leaves, and pretty much messing about with the core structures of the orchids can set them back, can stale them, and overall deplete them of energy. In this case, even if the orchid is vigorous, she will just not have energy to show it. And until energy is built up, we need to go through the process of very tiny growths, very poor root systems, dehydration issues, and that can just drag on pretty much for a few years. And if we don't know anything about the orchid, we might think, well, yeah, she's finicky, she's not for me, she has a genetic issue, but actually the orchid has just been mistreated. But just so you know, that can make an orchid become very finicky. And the last reason an orchid can be finicky is because of disease or pests. Viral and fungal infections can actually weaken the plant so much that it actually does have issues in producing new root system, new growth, and overall be healthy. In the case of a viral infection, there isn't anything we can do. Currently, there is no known cure for a viral infection. The immune system of the orchid has to fight it off. In some cases it does, while in others it cannot, and the orchid eventually dies off. In the case of fungal infections, they can be treated sometimes with fungicides, or the orchid can take care of it herself. But in other times, even with fungicides, the orchid cannot cope with it and eventually dies off. But in both of these cases, you will notice the orchid just creating smaller and smaller growths, not being vigorous, not being willing to create new roots, let alone blooming, that's a whole different story, and overall just deplete herself in front of your eyes. Now this is a serious case. Some orchids can actually live with the virus. They may or may not display symptoms. They may or may not bloom. They can have poorer blooms. There are quite a few possibilities. But overall, these orchids can perform a lot poorer than a perfectly healthy orchid. Here is my finicky Dendrobium Victoria Reginae. When I first purchased this orchid, it was winter and it grew so nice, so beautiful. Well, when the first signs of summer appeared, the orchid started to completely shift. I lost 2 new growths, and the orchid is trying to produce some new canes at the base, but you can see they're not the healthiest ones. I'm currently trying to provide at least a cool root system with the use of a clay pot and sphagnum moss, which is more friendly to delicate roots, and I'm hoping that she will do better from now, but roots are nothing to write home about. She doesn't really have enough energy to produce a nice root system, and the new growth has very tiny leaves. You can see I have a little bit of dieback as well. This happened before I switched her. I was trying semi-hydroponics, it didn't cut it. So I'm trying this now, but yes, this for me is a very finicky orchid, although it didn't start off that way, and we're still trying to recover. You've seen her earlier. This is my Masdevallia hybrid. The funny thing is, this orchid was sent to me to save, and I managed to save it somewhat. It had a period in which it looked very nice, very luscious, but then summer arrived yet again with its temperatures, and yeah, we lost the leaves once again. It's fun to see what's gonna happen this summer. I changed the setup again. I'm trying to provide a cool root system. I'm also installing my ultrasonic humidifier and a dedicated fan in a particular zone of my growth space. So overall, I worked a little bit on environment and hopefully that will do the trick. But for me, Masdevallias are definitely finicky, definitely. They can grow nice in winter and then all of a sudden just lose all of their leaves in a matter of a week or 2. It happened really fast. But there we go. And then you have the Oncidopsis orchids such as the Nellie-Eiler and the Francine. And even though they are a little bit easier than the Masdevallia, they still pose a few inconveniences. So this is my Francine. We are producing new growth, but you can see we are very, very seriously lacking vigor. If I compare this to my Cattleyas, there is a night and day difference. It's just the trait of the hybrid. If an Oncidopsis such as the Nellie-Eiler or this one, the Francine, is set back, I cannot expect a very speedy recovery, bigger growth from the get-go, because it's simply not that type of orchid. It has to do with its vigor coefficient, and that is sadly very low. But don't get me wrong, she is producing roots. The pseudobulbs are starting to plump up. You can see, yes, they look shriveled, but they were a lot more shriveled than this. Now they're gaining a bit of moisture, so that's good. We are growing roots. It's just that we have a long wait ahead of us. So these have been my finicky orchids, and of course the non-finicky orchids don't do any of this. They produce roots readily, they start growing bigger and bigger growths pretty fast, without me actually having to hassle too much or dedicate a particular corner of my grow space. Cattleyas, Phalaenopsis, even Oncidiums, Dendrobiums, the nobly ones I mean, they don't actually pose any difficulties to me, but stuff like the Miltoniopsis, oh my, they're very finicky. And now you know what I actually mean by that. So alrighty guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and you know the drill. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!